Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar provided to you by Molecule Group. My name is Krzysztof Bulski. I'm a podcast host myself. I have been a producer of many podcasts myself over the years, and I have a journalistic background. I used to work in one of Poland's major radio stations before moving with my career to Brussels. And today I would like to give you the opportunity to learn how to approach a project like a new podcast, how to think about building a strategy for your podcast, how to design and position your podcast so it's a successful podcast. And we will also discuss what it actually means to have a successful podcast, how to define a clear goal for a project like a podcast. Today it is my pleasure, and I hope to also share my knowledge, but also answer your questions. So please feel free to ask any questions you might have during this webinar. The webinar is live streamed on YouTube, Twitter, and LinkedIn. That's where we are. If you post your questions below on YouTube and on LinkedIn, I will see them here in the panel of the webinar, and I will be happy to take them and answer. So now let's begin. How to launch a successful policy podcast. This webinar is definitely not about all the questions you will have. We are focusing on today on the first stage, strategizing and launching a new podcast project. So the main question you have to ask yourself is the purpose of your project, of this podcast that will be a one-time short project of a few episodes, or maybe a long-term project that will go on over years with potentially dozens or hundreds of episodes. So you have to ask yourself why you are doing this. Without answering these questions, you will not be able to actually go forward with any elements of the strategy of the production process. So one of the most popular and most straightforward reasons of launching a podcast as a brand, as an advocacy group, as a trade organization, is building recognition, is constructing a platform that will make people aware of who you are. The podcast is also, and that's also a very obvious reason, a platform to communicate with your target audience, with, for example, the desired MEPs in Brussels you would like to influence, with some key stakeholders in your industry. It's a communication platform that works well if you know who you are addressing with your communication. Some organizations, and let's be clear on that, and let's also be very open and straightforward on that, are launching podcasts because it's a trend right now. And that's the only reason. That is not a real reason, because it's not a clear goal. Following a trend doesn't give you the opportunity to actually reflect what you want to achieve with the work you are putting in. And launching a podcast and maintaining a podcast project, regardless if you are hiring external support for that or doing everything yourself, this is hard work. So you have to understand first why you are doing this and what is the main purpose for you. One of the most undervalued parts of projects like podcasts or any other regular content production processes is using this as a platform for networking. Let me just give you an example of my own project, which is the EU Bubble Insider. It's a podcast where I interview key experts, stakeholders from within the EU bubble industry. And the goal of this podcast is to share knowledge that is usually very hidden behind either closed communities or closed paywalled courses. So I want to share that knowledge and make it broadly available for everyone who would like to understand how the EU bubble works. But there is another goal that this podcast meets for me professionally. It helps me in my networking, and it helps me talk to people that I would not possibly have the opportunity to meet otherwise. So a podcast is also a very useful tool, especially in the areas of lobbying, advocacy, to actually get to talk to people. You can invite high level key stakeholders in your topic, in your area, and you can talk to them. And also, apart from doing this podcast, you can build a valuable relationship, and that's what podcasts are very useful for. So what is a podcast? I have a couple of examples here. From the left, starting from the left, you have two people talking. It's a audio interview that is broadcasted, let's say on Spotify. That's a podcast. Then you have a video interview. That's actually the example of my EU Bubble Insider podcast. You have two people talking on camera remotely, also a podcast. Then you have the All In podcast. It's one of the most popular podcasts about technology and business in America. It's a couple of guys talking on video, so it's more like a group panel debate, also a podcast. Then you have, of course, EU Confidential, also a podcast. Then another project that is a totally different example, but still, it's a podcast. It's the weekly summary of the most important news within the offshore wind industry. This podcast is published by balticwind.eu, a news platform that covers the offshore wind industry. And this podcast, what it does basically, it reads the most important news within 5 or 6 minutes, usually 5. Very simple format, very easy to do. No scripting required, actually, because you just copy paste the leads from each article and you just deliver them. But very valued in the industry and with a quite impressive listening in terms of numbers. And then another podcast, the MEP Assistant. If you're part of the EU Bubble community, you might know this format. It's broadcasted on Twitch. And to be honest, I would rather call this a webinar, because it's a very informative session with lots of content, and it would probably be hard to follow only in audio. So it looks more like a thematic webinar, but still it's a podcast. So podcasts have many different forms. And actually preparing to this for this webinar today, I asked ChatGPT to help me with finishing up a list I was making. So I just wrote the first 2 lines and then let ChatGPT continue. And to be honest, this is a very broad list of examples, but all of them could be a podcast. So daily updates, expert panel, product review, a personal journal, Q&A session, a debate forum. You can even, for example, staying in the wind industry, Wind Europe, the organization representing the wind industry in Brussels, has their annual event, which is called Wind Europe Annual Event. So they meet every year in Bilbao and Copenhagen to discuss the newest and most important things. And of course, they have media partners. Now, one of those media partners is called the podcast partner of the event. So this shows you that a podcast could also be, for example, a dedicated one-off podcast project that is covering just one specific event. If the purpose is well defined, you can do many different things with this format called podcast. Simply said, a podcast is a conversation between you, your organization, and your audience. And it's very important to see it as, well, first of all, something that serves the community, but also in the end, and this is very different from all other multimedia formats, let's say, from anything else your organization might publish, is the way how people consume podcasts. There is this behavior that is very specific for podcasting. Research shows that 60 or even I think 70%, basically the majority of users who follow podcasts, who listen to podcasts, choose to listen to a podcast mostly while doing something else. So there's always another thing that they're doing, either commuting, cleaning, exercising, doing some errands, and listening to podcasts. We will speak about this in a bit later, but why is this important? Because none other format gives you the opportunity to connect on such an intimate way with your audience. And I see here's a question from Daniel. Will this also apply to a business podcast? Absolutely, because I'm also focusing on the policy and advocacy use cases, but it's we work with business, typical business client podcasts as well, and I think there are some specific references that I use, but they're applicable maybe not so much to B2C and consumer podcasts, but if you're talking about B2B and industry business podcast, then absolutely, I believe that anything I say will also be very applicable. So now the most important part of this webinar. I mean, if you would choose one slide that you have time to reflect on, it's this one. It's what makes a podcast successful. Because if you are part of an organization, you've been given the goal to launch a podcast, you might think that, okay, you have some idea for the project, but in the end, you will be asked for KPIs, for delivery of results. And probably you're thinking those results will be some numbers of viewers, times how much time have people spent listening to your podcast. And all those numbers are also very important. But they don't give you the opportunity to actually reflect if your podcast has met and delivered specific business goals or policy goals you might have. Those goals, maybe, for example, those who work in the in Brussels, in this Brussels bubble industry, know that sometimes it is important to just reach dozens of people, maybe even sometimes just 5 to 10 very important key stakeholders that you want to address with your message. And then in that case, that is your goal. And it will not matter if your podcast has been downloaded, listened to hundreds of times. It's something that is nice to have, but it's not the goal. And defining, and usually what we do with policy podcasts in the Brussels bubble, we try to start this process by compiling a list of, let's say, between 50 and 100 specific people this podcast wants to address. And this list will give us a lot of opportunities to, first of all, think about our target audience in a very specific way, but also it will allow us later on to measure if we met the results, because we will see, based on the reactions, did anyone from these people react to or comment on our podcast, or were we able to invite someone from that list as a guest to the podcast. So that's why the having a clear goal and understanding why you are actually launching this project called podcast for your organization or business. It's That's the first step. Then the next thing is reflecting on a sustainable production framework. What I mean by a sustainable production framework, it's very easy to record something once or twice, but if you have to do something every month, every quarter, but probably you will want to record your podcast every week or every 2 weeks, because one of the most important things with projects like this is to maintain a regularity of posting, to build a community of listeners around your podcast. So if that's the case, you need to be able to deliver a repetitive process of scheduling, recording, publishing, and promoting. Scheduling, recording, publishing, and promoting, and again and again and again. And you might have some external support. You might even have an internal team that will be able to support you on that. But in the end, it's an amount of work that needs to be addressed regularly. But there's also another part where you think that you need to consider with podcasts, with the sustainable production framework of podcasts, and that is, if you are, for example, inviting guests, how often will you be able to invite those guests? How easy it will be? If you are recording podcasts remotely, either audio or video, it might be easier because you're not so much dependent on your guests traveling. But if you have a studio recorded podcast, maybe it's in your office, then that also means that you need to take that into account. Because, for example, many clients we work with are member-based organizations in the Brussels bubble, and there is, of course, the need to record content with the members, which usually are not there. So that's also something that is really important to reflect. You want to come up with a strategy and a production plan for your podcast that will just work, that you will be able to maintain over a long-term period. Now, we said already that podcasts are anything you call a podcast, actually, and they can be video, then they can be audio. But what actually matters, and this is based on both the fact that more people listen to podcasts, even if they consume them on YouTube. YouTube is actually a very popular podcast listening platform, because people turn on their podcast on YouTube, but they don't watch it, even if it has a video component. What is most important is watching. But also there has been research done by Google that low quality of video will not make people turn off a podcast that often as it's the case with low quality sound. The quality of sound is your number one priority. You can have some glitches in the video. Maybe it's not the highest quality of the recording if you have a remote guest with a low quality camera, and if it's the only option to record, then fine, do it. But one thing you cannot compromise on is the quality of the sound. And of course, there are many ways to approach it technically, and I will speak about this also today. And then a well-defined target audience. We are focusing today on niche podcasts that are dedicated to a very specific topic, a policy topic. So probably you will never address your podcast to a big, wide audience. It will always be an audience of hundreds rather than thousands or millions. And therefore, you have actually a much easier job because you can actually make a list of, let's say, 50 to 100 people who are your dream audience, and reflect very deeply on who they are, what they want to listen, also how to add some personal touch. Because if you know that your audience is connected to one city, you know that you can, to build a connection with your audience, build some references. Let's say start by asking your guest how he enjoys the weather in Brussels or something like that. But you can only do this if you know for sure that your audience will understand either the reference or maybe the joke that you made to a specific um, thing that is very niche specific for either geographically or topic wise, etc. So understanding your target audience in the case of policy podcasts, but also in the case of niche business podcasts, where you are doing more or less the same thing with targeting, but from a business perspective, it's actually the most useful thing, and it gives you a lot of advantage over other podcasts that are more general in their approach, because you're not guessing. You know your audience very well. You know who you are talking to, and some of those people are your colleagues, maybe your if your organization is big, and some of them may be your friends. What is important here is that you always try to see this podcast project you're launching as part of something bigger, as part of a bigger conversation. So, for example, in terms of KPIs, one of the ways to measure if the podcast is successful is to see how much it reflects on the communication other members of your team have when they go to events. Did people mention the podcast as something they listen to? Was it a good opener of conversation? Did it help your advocacy team in their work? So that's kind of the very specific thing that should be taken into account in podcasts in the Brussels bubble and in the scope of policy. In terms of listening habits, the policy folks are no different than the rest of the world. Your podcast will be listened to while commuting. It will be listened to at work, at home, during lunch breaks. What is most important here also is to not see your and I think I already said it, but I will repeat that. Not see your audience as something, as numbers, as something that is just a general definition. My podcast audience are people between 25 and 44, half male, female, and they live in Brussels, let's say. What's good is to imagine that, for example, my podcast audience are people who are working on this policy topic in other organizations, in organizations that I can see as competitors. And then you write down the 10 people that you have in mind, and you try to understand what's important for them. What could change their mind, or what could maybe engage them in conversation, or maybe what could be controversial for them. How to add some contrast into your questions, or maybe who to invite as a guest, and so on. So now let me just have a sip of water. Let's discuss the planning phase. Assuming you already reflected on your goal, you already have an idea of where you are going with this project, why you are starting this, you have to choose a format. And I will never advise my clients from the start what is the best podcast for podcasting, because something like this doesn't exist. The best podcast format for you is the one that you can maintain in a sustainable way over a long period of time. So if you have a lot of money and a big team, let's go for the full studio experience with high quality 3-camera recording, and a nice environment, nice background of the studio that you also invested in, and that's great. But there are many other ways to deliver on your goals without having to go for the highest possible quality. You can do part in studio, part remote format. So some episodes are recorded with 2 guests sitting or 3 guests sitting around a table or on chairs, armchairs. And then sometimes you have a remote recording. There are many also nice ways to edit that later, that it really looks also nice and appealing for the viewer, not only for the listener. Then also the most easy solution is to record remotely, and you can do that both with video and with audio. But it's also good to reflect how much time and how much resources you have to edit the podcast. It's always easier to edit audio-only projects. Audio-only projects are faster in editing, and also there is much more opportunity to edit because any cuts can be hidden. If you are editing a video podcast, then cuts that, for example, if it's a live video recording that was done remotely, you don't have 3 cameras, you don't have a B-roll shot or a wide angle that you can cut into, then your cuts will be visible. So it's not always so easy to make the editing. Also, the question is, are you editing yourself, or are you using professional editors to do the job? If you're editing yourself, I would always go for the most simple solution and do a podcast that is audio only, because you will be, I'm sure that anyone can learn how to edit a simple audio podcast. It can be done, for example, in Canva, which I will talk a little bit also later on. The recording and the editing process is something that you should have an idea of how it will work before you start actually going into the project. You have to reflect, because it's connected to the formatting, and it's also connected to the distribution. How much content you will have from one episode. That's also part of the distribution and editing considerations. What I mean by that, you are recording, let's say, one 20-minute or 30-minute conversation. This 30-minute conversation can give you just one simple podcast that you publish on podcasting platforms, and that's it. But this 30-minute podcast can also give you a blog post that you can republish either together or later, as you wish, according to your plan. But this podcast can also give you a number of short quotes, sound bites that you can publish later on to remind people about the episode, to keep the conversation going. You can design static graphics with some quotes from the episode, and so on and so forth. If there were a lot of numbers mentioned, you can even come up with an infographic that summarizes the episode. That's part of the distribution plan, but that's also part of the editing process, because someone has to do that, and you have to have that planned in. Those content recycling opportunities, as they call them. And last but not least, sometimes it's more important, sometimes less important. In terms of policy podcasts, it's always important. Reflect if there are any legal considerations. For example, your organization financed by some EU funding, and you need to add disclaimers. That's also something that is important to reflect in this first initial planning phase. And I want to remind everyone, if you have any questions or comments right now, feel free to ask them in the comments. I'm seeing all your comments on those that are posted on either LinkedIn or YouTube. I see them here in the panel, so I will be happy to take them on. There'll be a Q&A opportunity in the end of the webinar, but if you have something that is interesting for you right now, feel free to post, and I'll try to take questions on if they're relevant to the discussed topic right away. So one of the parts of the planning and reflecting on the format of the podcast is also thinking who will be your first guest and what kind of guests you will invite. And of course, if you, for example, have the idea of a podcast that, let's say, covers a very specific policy topic or an industry, let's say the automotive industry, your idea is mainly, okay, I will invite guests with connection to the automotive topic, and that's obvious. So people who work on the specific regulations, maybe from the European Commission, maybe from some industry organizations. If you are an organization that has members, you can invite your members to discuss topics on your podcast. But apart from that, apart from those obvious types of guests, it's good to reflect on guests that will help you grow the audience. So sometimes if you are addressing your own audience that you already have built over the years with your podcast, then that's the great thing you have to start with. But for example, by inviting even representatives of some competitors' organizations to your podcast, you will first of all have a nice engaged discussion probably, but also your podcast will be shared with their audience, and by that you will reach possibly a new audience that may have not heard about you. So think of guests who can serve that purpose. Think of guests who can give you new reach and new opportunities to build a following of your projects. Also, there are a number of ways to engage listeners of your podcast. The list here says that you can have audience representatives, and of course, not in every format you will have the space and the formula to invite listeners. But if you're a policy podcast, then your listeners are most probably all key stakeholders or aspiring key stakeholders, and you can engage your audience by for example, after a time, seeing who's the most active commenter of the podcast episodes, and invite that person to one of the episodes, or ask your audience to provide questions. You can announce who's going to be the guest on the next episode and ask your audience to provide questions or topic ideas. There are many ways to invite people to participate in your project, but it's always good to reflect, if you are inviting a specific guest, what kind of purpose does the guest serve apart from just giving us great content. Now, the production process is something that has to be very thought out, but it has also to be flexible because circumstances change. We had a number of cases with our projects where we were not able to continue recording when COVID started. So you have to always be flexible. Sometimes you have to cancel a format. Sometimes you have to adjust it. Sometimes you have to change it. Sometimes you have to pivot it. Sometimes you have to adjust minor things. But always be able to be flexible and look for a better way to deliver the results you are doing this for. So what is a good process? A good process is that something that doesn't get boring, because if you get boring, you start doing things that are not as good as they were in the first couple of episodes. So it's good to look for ways to automate. If there are some boring elements of the process, think how you can automate them so you can focus your energy and enthusiasm on actually doing something that matters, that will make every episode stand out. What I learned is that, for example, one of the most important and impactful parts of the distribution process is how you write the post on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and how you actually announce the release of the episode. Of course, you have to reflect if you want to work with an agency or if you want your podcast to be self-made. Maybe you'll hire a studio. You can actually approach this by giving outsourcing everything, the entire process, except of your voice, of course, your appearance. But you can also outsource parts of the process. The big question that is connected to your capacity, your resources is, are you doing this in person or virtually? that's a big decision that you have to make. And of course, you have to reflect on the regularity of publishing your content, but also the publishing speed. Why is the speed important? Because, for example, you might record something that is time sensitive, and will not be so relevant if you publish it a month later. And given the type of guests you are inviting, you can also reflect on that ahead and plan accordingly. And now, what I mean by premium content, this may surprise you because we are talking about policy podcasts. What are we going to sell here? I'm not talking about premium content that sells. I'm talking about premium content that makes a specific group of people feel special. For example, if you're releasing your podcast on Monday and you're a member-based organization, try to send out the episode to your members on Friday and tell them, hey, this is the podcast we are releasing on Monday, but you are our members, you're getting this as premium experience a few days ahead. You can, for example, give your premium group an extra in form of a transcript of the podcast. So, for example, you can release it, and then the day later, if you send out a newsletter to your members or to your newsletter subscribers, you can add a link to the transcript, which for some people is a useful add-on, and I'm sure people will appreciate. Now, I told you that there are two ways to approach it, with many combinations, of course, but you can either hire an external support or do it in-house. So if you are thinking about hiring external support, I invite you to talk to us, to the Molecule Group. We have been doing this for years, not 4 years, but 4 years, more than 10 years now. We have experience in doing podcasts both for political topics and industry, and I'm happy to discuss together with my team to discuss what we can do for you and how we can help. But also there is, of course, the approach if you want to bootstrap your project, do it yourself. I would like to recommend 3 tools that will allow you to. They're not free. None of them will work well. Maybe Canva, but for example, SoundCloud. Of course, SoundCloud has a free version, but it gives you only a limited number of minutes that you can upload. So basically, in the end, you always have to have some budget ready to make a project like this work. Of course, this doesn't mention gear, but with today's microphones in phones or Apple headphones, you can actually produce something that is nice and works without very high level, high quality gear. I'm even not using. I have a microphone here. You can see it here. I have a microphone like this, but I decided to just use my headphones because it's easier for me today, and it works. I hope you enjoy the quality of the sound of today's webinar. So 3 tools that I would recommend to anyone trying to do it themselves is Riverside.fm. It's a tool that allows you to record very high quality audio and video. It records in high quality because while it records, it stores the files. It doesn't send them over. It doesn't stream the content to the cloud, but it records the file locally on the computer of each participant and then uploads it to the cloud while you record. Therefore, you will always get the highest possible quality based on the microphone and camera that your guest or you are using. Riverside also gives you the ability to actually edit your podcast within the tool, and it gives you the ability to repurpose content for Instagram, YouTube. So you have a square format, you have a vertical, you have a horizontal way to format your content. You can download the HD files. You can do many things. It's a brilliant tool, and I've been using it myself for a couple of projects. And I wish something like this would exist earlier. Now, Canva, of course, probably everyone who is listening knows Canva. You can design a cover for your podcast, but actually you can also edit your podcast. So let's say you record something on your mm, computer, phone, microphone, even on Riverside. You then download the audio, and you can, if you go to Canva, create new, and you write what? You write podcast video. It will actually recommend you the right format to edit, and you can edit a simple podcast with some even different sound levels of each track. You can add more than one track, so you can have even background music or some extra sound effects there. Canva is very easy to do that, and it's definitely for a bootstrapped, self-made project, the tool I would recommend. And then as a hosting platform, I find that SoundCloud is very helpful. You need a hosting platform, so you need one place where your podcast will actually be stored, and then from that platform it will be republished to platforms like Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, and so on. And if you want to post on YouTube, which is highly recommended because YouTube is a great platform for podcast promotion. Remember, YouTube is a search engine, so your podcast will be, if you do the right job with describing, using the right title, the right keywords in your title of the episode and the description, your podcast will be searchable on YouTube. So especially with niche topic focused episodes, it's an absolute must have, I would say, for promoting and reaching a broader audience. So that's the only platform you will not be able to republish from SoundCloud, but all the other typical podcasting platforms work with SoundCloud. It has analytics and so on, and it's also not too expensive. Altogether, it comes up to probably a budget that is way below €100 monthly, way lower. All those tools that I mentioned here, way lower than you would have to hire any external agency to help you with that work. So now the launch and distribution is always about targeting the specific communities. And if you have a community, it's easier. If you don't have a community, it's always good to think of whose communities can you tap into. And the easiest way to build your podcast with the use of someone else's communities is by inviting them as a guest. So nothing works better than just inviting someone who has a big following, who will reshare your podcast once it's live with them as the guest. So you can start building your first followers, first community for your podcast projects. So those collaborations, cross promotions. Think about it, how you can tap into someone else's audience by collaborating with them, by inviting them, and that's how you start. That's the best way to start. Another very important thing to think before you publish. To think about before you publish is SEO, because you publish your episode to be there for years, right? So you want your episode to be searchable even a year from now, and especially on YouTube. This is very important because YouTube is the second biggest search engine that exists. So you want people be able to find your podcast by the relevant keywords, asking the relevant questions. So, for example, podcast titles that actually answer a question or ask a question are always something that works well. And then depending on what resources you have, if you have a email distribution list, or maybe you have some content partners you can work with, member organizations, then the more of this groundwork you do, because if you just launch your podcast, even the most interesting episode, it will probably not get that much attention, because people these days don't have much time and they are overwhelmed with content. So you have to, regardless of how prominent your organization is, how prominent the guest is, you have to do the organic work. and the more you do it, the better, especially within in the first phase, the first couple of months, the first couple of episodes, until you build some recognition for your project. And here I would like to remind everyone, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them. So now I would like to talk about the final and most important part of the process, which is measuring results. I mentioned earlier that you don't want to focus on just numbers, because those, first of all, if you are launching a policy-related niche topic podcast, you will never get hundreds of thousands of views, except you're lucky and go viral for some reason. But in most cases, you will have a couple of hundred plays or views of your podcast, and that's already a good result. But even if you do, does this allow you to tell if you achieved a goal that you had with this project? I don't think so. It just allows you to show a good result, maybe to the rest of your team or to your boss, and that's great. We all want to show that our work meets the expectations, but it's way better if you focus on going back to what we discussed in the beginning of this webinar, to this actual goal of the project and the actual specific list of people who you are addressing with the project. And in case of policy podcasts in a city like Brussels, it's really easy to come up with a list of 100 people who are your dream listeners, and then analyze who has liked the content, who has maybe you heard that your I will go to that in a moment. Who has, for example, agreed to be your guest from that list? Because those people are probably also key stakeholders that you put on the list, and some of them you want to have as guests. Now, in terms of audience feedback, you, of course, it's a very tempting thing to ask people for opinions, but having seen a lot of projects like this, I can tell you that it's very hard to get people to respond to requests for feedback. And you will get a very low number of responses that will not show you any scale that is measurable and that you can interpret. But what works very well, and if you're working in the area of lobbying or advocacy, this is again what really matters, is doing a survey within your organization after a couple of months of the podcast being around, and ask people, has this podcast helped you? How do you rate the content that we produce? For example, have you used this podcast as a conversation opener on events? Did people approach you because they listened to our podcast? And so on and so on. You're doing this to meet specific goals of your organization. So ask members of your organization, ask your members and teammates from your advocacy team, from your policy team, from your regular team, whatever it's called. Ask your boss, anyone who can give you feedback. Was this project helpful? Was it useful? And then, of course, once you reflect and once you see, once you get that kind of response, you will know what to adjust. Because if you just have numbers like our podcast has been listened to by 120 people on average, and out of the 20 minutes average length of the episode, each episode is listened by in a half, more or less. So people turn off after half of the episode. Does this give you real insights on what to improve? It shows you could improve, but it doesn't give you the right insights on how exactly you can make this experience of people have with your content something that is just more applicable, more that allows you to make a real change. And yeah, that's all I have for you today in this section of this webinar. And now I would like to go over to the part where I answer your questions. So if you have questions, feel free to post them. One of the questions that have been posted before is about languages. And Stephanie has asked if it's possible to come up with a format that will address a number of different languages, or be able to hear for people from different European countries. Well, of course, it's a challenge. It's because the communication within the EU is both multilingual and multicultural, and that's always a challenging thing to address, both in terms of resources. But what is helpful here is that we have all this new technology that allows us to actually do things faster, cheaper, and with higher quality. And in terms of if you need, because if you're doing a policy podcast for Brussels, I believe English is fine. But if you want to do something for the broader audience and be able to broadcast your content to other countries, I would first think of the format. So how to make a format that is easy translatable, and then find ways to multiply either the versions. So with AI, for example, there is another tool called 11 Labs, and 11 Labs allows you, if you are the host of the podcast, allows you to duplicate your voice and produces content in any other European language. I think by now they have all the European languages, and you can just give the tool the transcript, and it will read your voice, the transcript in Polish, Spanish, Romanian, and so on and so forth. So that's one option. If you are doing interviews where it would be harder, and I don't think every guest would agree to multiply their voice in a different language, you can use subtitles, and you can add subtitles to YouTube, and that's of course something that works well. People are used to watching content in English with transcription with subtitles in their local languages. But I'm not sure this would work very well for longer formats, where you need to keep the attention, and it's, specific topics or niche topics are sometimes difficult to focus on. So I would only do subtitles as a tool here for shorter episodes. In case of a longer episode that needs to be translated, I would think of providing a transcript that can allow you to just send out your content to specific audiences. For example, on YouTube, you can add multiple links. Here's a transcript in French, here's the transcript in German, here's the transcript in Swedish, and so on and so forth. What is the name of the microphone that you are using? So today, and you can call this a webinar, but you can also call it a podcast. Today, I'm just using Apple AirPods as the source of sound, but and we have a number of different microphones that we use for different projects. One of the top companies that I would recommend looking at for podcasting, especially in-house podcasting, is Rode. For my one of my formats, which is the EU Bubble Insider, that I record very often while commuting, while traveling, I have this. Wait a second, let me make this bigger. I have this microphone that fits very well into any suitcase, and you can take it on with you on the go. I have a small tripod that I put it on, and it also works. So in terms of microphones, there are many options out there, and there are also many YouTube videos reviewing those microphones, but Rode is always a safe choice that allows you to record high and clean quality of your sound. I don't see any more questions, so thank you very much for participating today. If there are any more questions, there will be follow-up episodes of this webinar. So if you are rewatching this, feel free to ask in the comments, and probably I will get back to that question in another follow-up episode of this webinar. Thank you very much, everyone, for being today with me here. Thank you for watching, and thank you to those who are also rewatching this content, and thank you for my team to support me. Have a good day.